This is the most dangerous thing in the desert, yet the soldier who stepped on it didn't realize anything was wrong. The moment he turned around, the man instinctively rushed forward to help, but before he could take a second step, a sharp click echoed beneath his foot. He froze instantly. A wave of death crept up from his boots to his entire body, leaving his mind completely blank. Then his teammate's horrifying scream snapped him back to reality, but what he saw next made his blood run cold. Both of his teammates' legs had been blown off. He lay on the ground, bleeding uncontrollably. Forcing himself to stay calm, the man tried to comfort him while guiding him to inject a painkiller from his pack. But the injuries were far too severe. Without immediate treatment, his friend wouldn't survive. Desperate to save him, the man prepared to sacrifice his own left leg and jump forward to apply first aid, but his teammate refused to become a burden. He knew that even if he survived, he wouldn't last long in this environment. Taking advantage of a brief distraction, he suddenly pulled out his pistol and pressed it to his own head. The man screamed in horror, trying to stop him, but it was already too late. There was no response. This time, though he couldn't accept it, he had no choice but to face the cruel reality. After a long moment, he forced himself to calm down. He decided to live on, carrying his teammate's final wish with him. But the biggest problem remained. He was still standing on something deadly. Not knowing for sure whether it was a landmine, he slowly crouched down and pulled out a knife. Holding his breath, he carefully pushed the blade into the sand. The clear metallic sound that followed confirmed his worst fear. His heart sank. There was only one option left: wait for rescue. But the radio lay nearly 5 meters away. In his current position, it was impossible to reach. His mind raced. He removed his gear, took the sling from his sniper rifle, tied 2 ropes together, and attached a military knife at the end, creating a makeshift hook. Carefully, he tried to pull the radio closer. But the angle was awkward. After several failed attempts, he had no choice but to risk standing up. Every movement was slow and controlled. One wrong step would trigger the mine. When he finally stabilized himself and pulled again, he nearly lost his balance. At the last second, he caught himself with his hand and avoided disaster. Sweat poured down his face as he held his position. After a long struggle, he finally dragged the backpack within reach and pulled out the radio. He called headquarters immediately. But the response crushed him. Rescue would take 52 hours. In the scorching desert, surviving even one day was a miracle. Standing completely still for 2 days was almost impossible. Before he could ask for another solution, the radio battery died. With no other choice, he set a countdown on his watch and ate a small amount of food to preserve energy. When he reached for water, the bag was empty. In the desert, no water meant a death sentence. And to make matters worse, a massive sandstorm was approaching. Unable to move, he prepared to endure it head-on. He wrapped himself tightly, jammed his sniper rifle into the sand for support, and stabbed his knife deep into the ground to anchor himself. Now, all he could do was pray. The sandstorm hit with terrifying force, violently shaking his body, but he knew he couldn't let his foot move even an inch. After fighting with everything he had, he survived the storm. Then he noticed something drifting toward him. It was his teammate's body. He paused, gently covered his face with a hat, and took the batteries from his pocket. But when he turned around, his backpack was gone, blown far away by the storm. That was his last lifeline. Only 6 hours had passed on the countdown. The remaining water was gone. He had reached absolute desperation. In rage and despair, he fired several shots into the sky, hoping anyone might hear. Even the enemy would do. But this was an empty desert. No one came. Finally, he raised the gun toward himself, just like his teammate had done. But suddenly, a black man appeared in the distance. Grabbing onto Hope, he shouted for him to stop and warned him about the minefield. But instead of stopping, the man kept walking forward, using a strange, deliberate stepping pattern. The man didn't overthink it. He simply told the stranger that he was standing on a landmine and desperately needed water. Luckily, the man understood English. He took the canteen and handed it over. After drinking, the trapped man begged him to help retrieve the backpack nearby. But instead of helping, the stranger mocked him, laughing at how a tiny landmine had completely trapped him in place. Then he turned around and walked away, still using that strange stepping pattern. This made the man realize something unsettling. That landmine might belong to him. Not long after, while he was barely holding on, a young black girl suddenly appeared in the distance. She walked using the same unusual stepping style. She quickly approached and handed him water. He drank greedily, finally easing his burning thirst. Pointing to his left, he tried to ask her to bring his backpack, but she didn't understand English and ran away. At this point, rescue was still 38 hours away. He finished his last piece of food and played music on his MP3 player, hoping it would make time pass faster. But the desert was cruel. When the sun set, the temperature dropped to freezing levels. He gathered dry branches and made a small fire to survive the night. Worse still, he couldn't sleep. After dark, wolves began roaming nearby. He could scare them off with his gun for now, but bullets wouldn't last forever. And when they ran out, it would be the end. The mental pressure was unbearable. He had to stay awake and alert at all times. One moment of carelessness, one small movement, and the mine would explode. Because his left foot had stayed in the same position for so long, it had turned dark purple. Even without the mine, his leg might die from lack of blood flow. More than 30 hours had passed. Hallucinations began. He heard radio voices that weren't real. He even started talking to his dead teammate. At one point, he almost put a scorpion in his mouth before realizing what he was doing. He quickly drank a few mouthfuls of urine to force himself to stay conscious. Then the strange man returned. He told him, "If you want freedom, you must be brave enough to take the next step." The trapped man swallowed his anger and calmly explained his situation, but once again, he was met with mockery. Still, he couldn't afford to argue. He needed help. After constant pleading, the man finally brought the radio. But no matter how much he called out, there was no response. The silence nearly broke him. The old man hesitated, then said quietly, "Even broken." Before turning and leaving, only 24 hours remained. The midday sun burned his skin and made him dizzy, exhausted and desperate. He decided to trust the old man's words. He cut open his shoe, preparing to lift his foot. But fear stopped him. He simply couldn't take that step. Suddenly, he noticed a small animal on the ground. Driven by hunger, he grabbed it and ate it. Almost immediately, his body heated up. The radio voices returned. The animal was poisonous. Even so, he refused to move. In his mind, the mine was still beneath his foot. Then, far in the distance, dust rose into the air. Through his binoculars, he saw rescue vehicles approaching. But the desert was too vast, and he was too small to be noticed. He spotted a flare nearby and tried to hook it closer. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out. He looked up and saw the same criminal he had encountered earlier, just as he reached for the flare. Another explosion knocked it away. Furious, he grabbed a machine gun and fought back. With his combat experience, he quickly eliminated the attacker. But the flare had been blown far beyond reach. The rescue team was slowly disappearing into the distance. All he wanted was to survive. Why was it so hard? Filled with anger and desperation, he closed his eyes and thought about his wife waiting for him at home. Then he clenched his fists and stepped forward, ready to face death. But there was no explosion. He froze in shock. Had he been trapped here all this time by his own fear? Determined to know the truth, he carefully dug into the sand. What he pulled out left him speechless. It wasn't a landmine, it was just an empty metal can. The man stared at it in silence. In reality, everyone stands on something they fear. But no matter how dangerous the situation seems, sometimes, all it takes is the courage to take one more step. Because what's waiting for us might not be disaster, but hope. The movie ends here. Thanks for your watching. Leave your comments below and don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this. Turn on the notification, and leave a like to help the channel out.